view we have today of the physical and cultural environment from which Judeo-Christian religion emerged is expanding rapidly. New imaging technologies, massive databases, and online services now link the work of countless researchers in real time, enabling collaboration and coordination on an unprecedented scale. From the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948 to the present day, field archaeology in Israel continues to expose new strata of our story. Not just confined to land, exploration continues in the Sea of Galilee and in the Mediterranean. 2,000 years ago, Jesus invited people to begin the exploration of a spiritual domain, which he called the Kingdom of Heaven. He taught that if we gave priority to discovering this one reality, all the essentials for a progressive civilization would fall into place. But in today's world, his concept of the kingdom is understood as little more than a socialist utopia or a metaphysical abstraction of the afterlife. The historical Jesus cannot be fully understood without an assimilation of the meanings and values of his life, a reimagining of the story which has profoundly influenced the art, literature, and ethics of the world for more than 2,000 years.
It is difficult to establish a starting point for a story whose origins are lost in the mists of past eternity. We'll choose a time at the end of the last ice age when a vast savanna covered the Arabian Peninsula, extending across what is now Jordan and into southern Israel. Suspended between the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, it was a paradise for nomadic hunters and herders. They built structures extending great distances into the savanna for the trapping of wild animals. They built stone corrals for their domesticated herds. They built habitation sites, perhaps precursors to villages. In the high mountain passes, they arranged stones to assure safe passage. They maintained altars for remembering their ancestors. They constructed sanctuaries for honoring their totemic animals. Here it was the Arabian leopard. Now nearly extinct, Arabian leopards ranged into northern Galilee and the slopes of Mount Hermon in Jesus' time. Perhaps it was among these hunters and herders that a blood sacrifice was first thought to be an appropriate gift to win the favor of their gods. But with the progressive desertification of the Arabian Peninsula, many of these people migrated north to the region west of the Jordan River in search of grazing lands for their herds. They encountered the early cities of the Canaanites. Herders were mixing with agriculturalists. Desert nomads were mixing with urban dwellers. It was here in this dynamic milieu astride the major communication routes of the time, around 2000 BC, that one of the most significant events in human history occurred, the incarnation of Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the angel of the Lord. Melchizedek's purpose was to stimulate a transition to monotheism. A culture based on a monotheistic deity concept had to evolve before Jesus could incarnate to reveal the personal character of that deity. Melchizedek spent 100 years teaching at his Salem headquarters. He taught the worship of a universal deity, a God which responded to faith, not the offering of sacrifices or the shedding of blood. It was in Ur of Mesopotamia, where Abraham heard about the mission of Melchizedek and traveled to Salem to meet him. The descendants of Abraham kept alive the teachings of Melchizedek until the times of Moses, 1,000 years later. Moses ignited the embers of Melchizedek's teachings in the desert tribes under his influence, giving birth to Hebrew monotheism. Today, the remnants of the Melchizedek teachings provide sustenance for more than half the people in the world, the people of the book. Circles of stone in the desert gave way to tabernacle, and tabernacle gave way to temple, and a growing priesthood. By the time of Solomon, Hebrew religion had assimilated much from Canaanite, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian religious beliefs. Monotheism only gradually evolved in Hebrew culture, fostered by a sequence of prophets, many of whom suffered greatly for their efforts to keep people oriented to the God of Melchizedek and Moses. But these prophets achieved the greatest feat in the history of religion, the conceptual evolution of a universal deity from a background of pagan polytheism. They gradually transformed the barbaric concept of the jealous and wrathful spirit god of the Sinai volcano into the exalted concept of the supreme Yahweh, creator of all things. These people had begun to realize that Yahweh was far greater than the god of a tribe, a nation, a race, or even an entire world. And thus did the process begun by Melchizedek some 2,000 years earlier prepare the stage for the appearance of Jesus, who would be a revelation of the personal character of this universal God.
At the time of Jesus, Jerusalem was dominated by the temple and its politics. The ancient Zadokite priesthood had broken up a century and a half earlier as a result of corruption. The temple rulers had preserved Hebrew religion in spite of the Greeks, Parthians, and Romans only by making it into a rigid system of ritual, tradition, authority, and nationalism. The northwest shore of the Dead Sea had become a refuge for devout believers fleeing the politics and corruption in Jerusalem. An oasis in a barren landscape, the numerous springs of En-Gedi provide the only source of fresh water for miles around. En-Gedi had provided a place of political and spiritual sanctuary for more than 3,000 years. In Jesus' time, it was a gathering place for itinerant religious ascetics and herders of the desert. It was here, among these spiritual refugees, that John the Baptist had begun to build a following. John was a living summary of the best of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. His teaching echoed Melchizedek's promise that when the time was ripe, another messenger would be sent. In John's view, that time had arrived. The caves in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found are a short distance to the north of En-Gedi. Perhaps it was this Isaiah scroll found at Qumran in which John the Baptist read of a coming deliverer who would be as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land, who would comfort those who mourn and bring the joy of salvation to the place of sorrow and despair, who would set the spiritual captives free, who would hear the cry of the needy and save the souls of the poor who seek him, who would bind up the brokenhearted, one by whom all his children on earth would be blessed, a deliverer who would be the desire of all nations. Northern Israel is dominated by the majestic presence of Mount Hermon, rising some 10,000 feet above the Sea of Galilee. Her waters begin their flow from springs and streams emerging from the mountain at its lower elevations.